call me Bucky, lucky that I'm innocent. If I didn't have no morals, I'd be menacing. How about rapping conscious but he ignorant? How he from the hood but still gon' go legitimate? How he fuck a bunch of but they still respect the women? He still rolling, it's another, he just got the windows tinted. Homie stab me in the back and that can never be forgiven. And my palms been itching, man, I like the superstition. You can't have my phone number unless we running up the digits. Let me meditate, I just need a couple minutes. Tryna low ball me, my cojones to the big ass. When I get high, I ain't looking at the clock, still ballin' like Brian. Yeah, I'm headed to the Bucks, then I'm ballin' like yeah. I ain't looking at the clock, still ballin' like Brian. When I get high. Let me meditate, then I celebrate. Tryna get the cake, I don't take a break. Yeah, wait. Grew up in the 90s, we was watching Ricky Lake. We was eating top ramen or a TV dinner plate. Made that couple dollars, so I probably get the steak. Go on out at John and Venice, I told Quinn and I'll be late. Ay, I'm so epidemic, I'ma cause an epidemic. Put my feet up in the building, feel it like a tenant. When I get high, I ain't looking at the clock, still ballin' like Brian. Yeah, I'm headed to the Bucks, then I'm ballin' like yeah. I ain't looking at the clock, still ballin' like Brian. When I get high.
Woo! I'm working late because I'm a singer. A big shout out to the 7% who read both books. Proud of you. Keep up the good work. Proud of you. Was going to read it yesterday, but we had a Pride event to go to. Maybe you should be proud of reading. I hope you had a good time. Happy June 1st. So, I can't help it. Are you prouder of 81% of you did not read either book. So, I don't even know why you're here. Expect me to just summarize the book for you? Yeah, who's in the 7%? Show yourselves. Diz my nail art. Jeez, Ben, relax. 11% Paulina. I know you read it. Paulina, you had read Chain Gang All-Stars before we picked it as a book. I think I saw you talk about this. Why did you ever choose that book, Ben? Do I want a smoothie? Christine, I would have a third of a smoothie. I'll have 3. I would like 3, actually, yeah, like 4/12ths of a smoothie. Maybe 4/13ths. Hey, you changed your glasses? Yeah, I know. I finally replaced my broken glasses. Also, I did get a haircut yesterday and trying new barber. No offense to barber. I think I need to find another barber. Christine, a few other people want a smoothie, by the way. If you could help us out with that. All right, who else read both books? Oh, the percentage is going. It's 6% of you now. I think very few people only read Correction. I think more people read Chain Gang All-Stars. Christine's a better bar. I know. I should just go back to Christine cutting my hair.
I'm retired.
Christine's here.
Here.
Look at you.
Smoothie.
All right. Book club.
Sorry, it's too much.
Christine, do you know how to read? When are you going to read a book with us? You've got all this. You've got so much time to read.
No. When are you going to clean this couch so I can sit?
I don't know.
How am I supposed to have a seat?
Maybe it's my office and I want it to be messy.
Why do you have a couch at all? Okay, enjoy reading or whatever.
All right. Book club will end before Christine's Menchie Game Gang stream at 2. Let's talk about... Okay, this music's a little much. That's a little much. I thought I said no vocals. Christine only reads nail polish bottles, yeah. Corrections was so good, I gave it 5 stars. I liked it more than Chain Gang, I think, but barely. So, okay, I read Correction, subtitle Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change by Ben Austen. And when I say read it, I listened to Correction as an audiobook, and then I read Chain Gang All-Stars. And it was pretty jarring going from one to the other. Like, at a fundamental level, they're both invitations to reconsider how prisons could exist in an entirely different way, or we could live in a society, or how the prison system is really a reflection of society, and how we can imagine a prison system that isn't so dehumanizing and inhumane. Really, if we want to be super reductive about it. But after listening to Correction, which is a pretty like sober, I don't want to say dry, because it's well written and like engaging. It's almost like listening to the Shawshank Redemption Correction. So let's just get into a summary. Correction is a deep look at mass incarceration, and really specifically the parole, the politics of parole and the parole process. Told through the lens or perspective of 2 different men serving life for indeterminate sentences. Yeah. So it's like the history of parole, but then also giving you like this sort of deep dive into the experience of these 2 different men, one of whom is very possibly wrongfully convicted, which is really, I guess, interesting in terms of storytelling, but I actually think almost did a bit of a disservice to like the... Actually, I want to be careful how I put this. I think it's considering the ethics of releasing an incarcerated population is really different if you also think this person shouldn't be in prison in the first place. Whereas the story of the other, of Michael, the other individual documented in the story, I think is a little tougher or more interesting to grapple with, just in the sense that this was someone who did a terrible thing when they were a teenager, and the question is, what does it mean for them to what is a just sentence? You started without me. I listened to Corrections as well. It was good. It was like, I liked reading Corrections at first. It gave me a basis for understanding the prison system better than I could imagine for Chain Gang. So Correction also struck me as a pretty, almost dispassionate, kind of neutral. It's Correction's like written from someone who like knows how to do old school journalism. You know what I mean? It's kind of like dispassionate. Like, I think you can infer what the author's politics are at times, but was not written as a piece of advocacy. Like you get the impression this person wants you to consider how opening up opportunities for people to not rot away in prison is sort of there, but otherwise they're not really throwing in your face their sort of politics of what they think should or shouldn't be the case. And then, so yeah, you go from this sort of nonfiction book about a parole process that is rather bureaucratic and formalized and flawed. And then the next thing, I'm reading this book about these sexy black women killing each other for their freedom in this dystopian fictional novel about a future United States where the correctional system has turned into a form of entertainment for the masses, that they have made a blood sport out of letting prisoners elect to voluntarily fight for their lives in like a reality TV style game show. And if they can survive for 3 years, they win their freedom. So yeah, I wonder if I had read these books in a different order, if it would have changed things, because Chain Gang All-Stars seemed very sensational. Seemed absurd when I first started reading it, after reading a very sort of grounded fictional book about the parole process as it currently exists. Is correction fiction as well? No. Correction is a non-fiction reporting book about two men serving indeterminate sentences and their experiences trying to convince a parole board to let them go free. One of them was convicted of killing a police officer and maybe falsely convicted of doing that. And even his conviction was based on the theory of accountability, that he wasn't necessarily the one who himself killed the police officer, but was just thought to be at least involved in it in some way. Is there a reason these specific books were picked this month? Chain Gang, both these books showed up on like best of 2023 book lists. So I was interested in them just from that perspective. And thematically, topically, I'm interested in crime. You know, a lot of the discussions these two very different books evoke kind of threw me back into, or very much reminded me of discussions I was having 10 years ago in school. And I think Correction does a good job of this as well. Like, he frames it as a very depressing thing, and I guess it is, but like a lot of the same, there's sort of like this cyclical thing where I guess even in the US, there have been moments in time where it seems like there is some avenue towards a more progressive, humane, or, you know, system of justice that's a little bit more willing to prioritize rehabilitation. And then that tide will sort of turn and you'll have a wave of sort of more populist, tough on crime sentiment that just sort of works politically. I'd recommend Just Mercy, by also nonfiction, who's trying to overturn wrongful convictions, death penalties. Yeah. Something interesting about Chain Gang All-Stars, before I maybe give a broader summary, is so clearly a fictional story about a future in which, you know, prisoners are basically degraded to fight to the death for entertainment, for just a slim possibility of being released. But the book is punctuated by footnotes where, it's interesting, I heard the author sort of talk about this process a little bit, where he goes like, at first he was still sort of learning about the prison industrial complex, carceral state. So he was writing from the perspective of this protagonist, Thurwar, who is this woman who's survived almost 3 years and is sort of on the cusp of freedom. And he was saying like, oh, when I realized like there was things like she'd need to do, like just eat. So I'd think like, oh, how would that work in this sort of world I've constructed through this book? Then he's like, then I do research on how prisoners eat and how they're malnourished and how that's bad. So it's like at first it kind of seemed like he worked backwards from like, I'm writing this fictional story, then I'll think of like, how do prisoners in 2018, what is their sort of experience in reality of these different aspects of just trying to live in a prison complex. So like there's footnotes all over the book about overrepresentation of certain populations or wrongful convictions. Because I guess one thing this author has had to deal with is like, it's such a sensational concept. I think some criticism of the book has been is it sort of distracting from like a more reasonable or practical conversation about what is wrong with the prison system if you're starting from this more like futuristic, sexy, gladiator style like sort of concept. And I heard the author was giving an interview on some morning television show where his defense of that, or his explanation, is that, you know, the prison industrial complex as it exists today is incredibly violent. I think he even said equally violent in a different way, which I think is kind of a ridiculous statement, but I think if we're give him the benefit of the doubt and some grace, I think the point still stands that the prison system as it exists today in the U.S. is very dehumanizing and a place where a lot of people experience incredible violence and have to survive dehumanizing conditions. That maybe the book is pulling that string to its extreme, but it still offers some sort of parallel or way of thinking about how we should or could have empathy for people, even people who have done terrible things. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly, the profit motive of the book, Jess, is really obvious. So I guess this is a difference between Canada and the U.S. So in the U.S., there are for-profit prisons. I guess that was maybe even one weakness of the book, that I think if anything it pushes to the extreme is the idea of like rich white men in a room sort of celebrating the money they can make by just killing poor black people. You know what I mean? That felt a little on the nose, let's say. Because like if I think in real life, there are really terrible real life examples of like judges who are taking payoffs for imprisoning people because there are for-profit prisons, for example. But that's sort of like studying crime and criminology from the perspective of serial killers. Like, yes, there are serial killers, but there's way more sort of just broader systemic issues. I guess if I'm using the serial killer analogy, like you wouldn't want to understand why people commit crime just from the perspective of studying serial killers. Just like you wouldn't want to understand the perverse incentives of for-profit prison systems just by looking at like the most sort of evil and corrupt like executives. Do you know what I mean? I feel like people are going to misinterpret what I'm saying right now. Whereas I'm just saying like sometimes giving the very reductive, overt, easy villain sort of obscures a more helpful or real conversation. There are for-profit prisons? What? How is that allowed? Yeah, that's a pretty uniquely... I mean, America isn't the only place that exists, but... Anyway, so Chain Gang All-Stars, yes, the story centered around these two women who are also lovers trying to survive in this... dystopia. How do I summarize this book? Maybe I'll just sort of explain the concept of... So in the book, if someone who is already in prison consents or elects to participate in this CAPE program, what is this? Offender entertainment something, prisoner something? Sorry, I should know what that is. Anyway, you can choose to participate in this reality TV show where if you survive for 3 years, you get released. But every week, you're basically just in a death match with other people. You get grouped up with your sort of, your gang, your chain gang. and you sort of live with them outside of these death matches. And I guess they sort of explained that at first the concept was more about like these people were like living in the wilderness and camping, and then just once a week they would do these fights. But then I guess they realized the entertainment value and profit was in like the death matches, not wanting people to die because they're trying to survive in the wilderness. Battle Royale, is that the appropriate term? I think death match is the way to put this. Anyway, you're introduced to these two characters who are also lovers, and one of them, Thurwar, the other is Stax. So Thurwar is almost at her 3 years, close to prison. But then sort of the big sort of shift or plot device here is that they learn that before she gets to her freedom, they're changing the rules for the next season where she'll have to fight her partner for the chance at freedom. We're skipping over a lot here. It was very much Hunger Games meets U.S. prison system. I think that's really fair to say. Maybe people won't like that because Hunger Games is kind of like young adult fiction, but like, let's be honest, this was also kind of... Yes, this was very Hunger Games. Also, I hope nothing I say is criticism of the author is... I mean, not that I'm being all that critical. I guess I just want to say, even in past book clubs, if I'm being critical of an author, I respect the hell out of people who are willing to, like, who have the guts to write a book, especially fiction, especially like younger people trying to write and make it as authors. I have a ton of respect for that. So anyway, so huge spoiler alerts. Like Squid Games. Yeah, I've heard the author, he went on Seth Meyers. He did an interview on Late Night with Seth Meyers. I guess that's kind of cool that he has authors on. Where, yeah, he sort of acknowledges the parallel with Squid Game. Or I think he used it to sort of say, like, there's people who watch Squid Game who didn't realize it was a critique of capitalism. Like, you know, Tim Pool. He didn't say that. I'm saying that. The author is 33 years old, so definitely a younger author, yes. He said he spent 7 years working on this book, too. Which doesn't mean he was writing a book for 7 years. It's just, I think it takes a long time for things to percolate. So anyway, if we're just going to do a total spoiler review / summary, the book ends in a way that people have found very controversial. So basically, these two women are put in this position thinking, like, we're basically being forced to fight to the death for our freedom. Like, what are we going to do? And they sort of agree that, you know, no matter what happens, what we're going to do is try, and we don't want to waste that opportunity. In the background of the novel, you see from other people's perspectives. You see it from like the people who run the sports program or profit from this perverse entertainment. You see the perspective of fans who like watching these death matches, and you also see the perspective of prison abolitionist advocates protesting against these prisoners being turned into entertainment. And I actually thought that was some of the most interesting stuff of the book, was seeing it from those other perspectives. And throughout the book, there is this sort of percolating feeling of an increasing resistance and sort of humanity of people really sort of saying, like, what are we, you know, doing here that we're willing to just reduce these people to just sort of our entertainment, just see their lives sort of squashed out, right? The ending is what makes the Hunger Games comparison fall apart for me. So anyway, the ending, huge spoiler alert. I recommend this book. It was really, how do I put this? Easy to, it's engaging. Like it wasn't a hard book to get through. Does my nail art? I want to get back to the husband and wife perspective, the fans of watching it. But yeah, so the book ends in a way that I think a lot of people have found kind of controversial, because it's, I'll give you my interpretation. So the woman Thurwar, who's, if she wins against her partner, will get her freedom, is going against Stax, who is also getting closer to her freedom, but is a few months away, I think. They agree to like try against each other, and then they sort of agree whoever comes out on the other side of this, like we know because of our love for each other that all we'll want to do after this is dismantle this system. And so it ends with, my interpretation is that Stax is going to win the fight and deliberately loses. I think that's pretty I think that's pretty obvious. My reading anyway. And it ends just, I think, just evoking that idea that now that this other, that Thurwar has her freedom, that there's some hope that she'll be a useful tool for dismantling the system from the outside. But it ends in a really sort of jarring and blunt and sudden way. I agree, but I had to reread the end like 5 times. Yeah. I have to say, I know I've seen a lot of people say like this book's really does a really good job of writing fight scenes. And I guess that's true. I don't disagree with that. But at the same time, I'm pretty uninterested in reading lengthy descriptions of battles. How does it end? I want to know. It ends just like that, just with the one woman delivering the sort of final blow of the fight, and you realizing that she just killed the other. But that also meaning that was her one barrier to freedom, and you are reminded not long before that point that their expectation is whoever survives it will go on to try to tear things apart. So that's sad. Womp womp. I think I'd rather just talk to you than look at this. Yeah, someone already brought up in Chain Gang All-Stars. Yeah, it's really interesting how they show you the perspective of different people. And yeah, I want to... Yeah, the perspective of the husband and wife who are big fans of the sport. And I should say it's really the husband's a big fan, and like the woman is trying to get into the sport to, I guess, rekindle some sort of meaningful relationship with her husband. Anyway, this might sound kind of goofy, and at times it was a little goofy movie, but I think it did a good job of showing the sort of like, I guess there's a big question around the book of like, how much could you imagine this being like a realistic scenario that people would be willing to watch other people just kill each other for sport. And I actually think in terms of being able to believe this is possible, the perspective of these fans who are just sort of willing to just see it as sport and not really see the humanity in the people on the screen in front of them, I think that really came through a lot here in a believable way. The wife is really into the reality show side, which I feel like a lot of people would be. I hated the husband character so much. He's the super fan. Yeah, it kind of like I went to a UFC fight. God, this was what, like 7 years ago? It was Rory McDonald against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. It was like the one time the UFC came to Ottawa. So I'm like, fuck it. So I went with a old friend. And we were sitting there. And the fights were terrible. It was not a good night. And there was a fight in the night between these like two guys who weren't very skilled. Like, they're not martial artists as much as they were just guys just sort of having like a brawl. And I remember thinking, like, this is just sort of sloppy and gross. And I remember sort of looking around, and there were so many people there who just were very interested in just seeing how violent it was getting. And there's this old man in particular beside me who I don't think he was there with anyone. He was just sort of alone, like sitting right next to me. Just like so obviously like getting off on like the raw violence of it in a way that made me so uncomfortable that I'm like, huh. Like I kind of stopped watching MMA after that. Just because like I do think there's something sort of I do think there is some a lot you can appreciate and admire about, you know, athletes. You know, I think there is art in mixed martial arts, let's say. But seeing how much the crowd was just there to see other people hurt each other made me sort of think, like, I don't know, this whole sort of spectacle is much closer to just people wanting to see people hurt each other than whatever I thought I was there for. This is how I feel when I see people get excited over hockey players when they bash each other into the sideboards or start punching each other. Yeah, the more a sport is just about inflicting pain or hurt on other people, the more I can acknowledge or empathize with that argument. Like, I'm not sitting here saying, like, I'm totally against contact sports. I love hockey. I'm going to watch hockey tonight. But yeah, it is a little disturbing to me how much people seem to really just get off purely on the violence part of it. And Christine, your hockey point is well taken, because, you know, when a fight breaks out of the game, sometimes that is, a lot of people think that's the most exciting part. Now, I think it plays into the whole drama and momentum and storyline of a series and how much people are willing to put themselves on the line. And hockey has a sort of unique culture in that the game sort of polices itself more than it's entirely reliant on refereeing. So I do think there's a place for violence in hockey, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be any violence in sports. But when your sport is fundamentally about violence, I thought we as a society were a little bit beyond that. But seeing how much UFC fans clearly were just interested in watching other people bleed makes me think it's not, if you turned on the television right now and there was a TV show about people consenting to fight to the death, I think there would be an audience for that show. And that is kind of terrifying. Now, I think what the book maybe sort of fails to, where I think this sort of like extreme, if Chain Gang All-Stars is trying to say like, hey, our current system sort of isn't that far removed from this sort of perverse celebration of violence, I think where that falls apart is the recognition that some of our institutions are a little bit more resilient to completely devolving into the wants and desires of violence-seeking public or mob. And that's where a book like Correction comes in and sort of does show that there's a lot of people putting a lot of thought and time and energy into how to have a just criminal justice system, trying to just do the best they can, you know. I've been talking a lot. I want to know what you think. So I guess we just talked about this, but do you think something like this prison entertainment program thing is a realistic possibility? I'm yapping over here. Yeah, and did you like the end of Chain Gang All-Stars? I noticed from looking at Discord, I feel like people did just like the book in general, but I know the ending is sort of controversial. Actually, yeah, 85% of you didn't read, so I don't even know who am I asking? I like the ending after sitting with it for a bit. I liked the ending. I'll speak for myself. But I'm kind of a sucker for not ambiguous endings, but I'm very okay with a book leaving a lot to the imagination or ending abruptly. Like there's a definite resolution here. You're talking to 8 people who actually read the book. I just like hearing your opinions. Aw, thanks, Jess. I would recommend Chain Gang All-Stars. I liked it. It is a little goofier than most books I would read just because I don't read a lot of I don't know, those sort of more fantastical element or even just descriptions of fighting isn't something I typically look for in a book. But I did want to touch on something really interesting in the book is actually I could talk about this in relation to both books. Because like I was saying, Correction, I felt while I was reading it, tried to stay a little neutral, not in terms of not really advocating overtly for any sort of like political persuasion, other than just the sort of invitation to consider how we could have a more empathetic system that opens up the opportunity to redemption and second chances for more people. But I was watching an interview with the author, Ben Austin, just this morning, where I thought he was way more open and transparent about how much he thinks the prison industrial complex is a disaster and a huge failure. And yeah, he has some totally valid points, and he sort of used Norway as an example and reference point that I think was effective, a place where prisons seem much more adequately built and designed to be places of reformation and not just warehousing dangerous populations or populations that fall through the cracks. Although there was one question asked of him that I thought he didn't have a very good answer for, which was what sort of responsibility did he feel to storytelling about victims of crime in his book? And his answer went 2 places. One, there's a chapter in his book about how a lot of victims' rights groups may have started in like sort of a organic way, but in many cases were in reality sort of co-opted by sort of right-wing political groups or influences, so that like a lot of victim rights groups are just sort of have these sort of like rich Republican female figureheads, and they're not really all that representative of people who are even victims of crime, and kind of just become tools of using fear as a political tactic, let's say. So to me, the fact that his answer about like, where does your story consider victims of crime, he sort of immediately went to, well, a lot of victims' rights groups are really just sort of like these disingenuous political actors trying to use it for political means. But it's like, yeah, that's true, but there's also real victims on the other side of a lot of the stories you're telling, Like, his stories do a lot to humanize these two men, and I'm thinking of the Michael story in particular, because it's really hard not to read 300 pages about somebody and see the humanity in them and not reduce them to the worst thing they've ever done. But I felt there was very little consideration really given to the person he killed as an 18-year-old so indiscriminately. Like, you hear a little bit about their family showing up to parole hearings. And to be fair to the author, he does describe that. He says, even if you're just thinking of like victims of crime and their families, the system as we have it now isn't really fair to them either, in the sense that, imagine if like you had a family member brutally murdered, and your way of participating in, participating in the process was to like show up to a parole hearing every few years to have to argue for why the person who did it isn't released. Like, that's a really traumatic and awful thing to have to live with, right? And I thought it was sort of interesting that he went there, because he's basically describing why, like, giving people parole can be something that is really unfair to victims or the families of victims, while at the same time, I think he's clearly advocating for expanding the access to parole for a lot of people, and saying like there's no way, like, the mass incarceration you see in the United States is so abnormal and abhorrent, like, you really can't justify it. So how do you open up these opportunities for people to be released from prison? So I think this is just sort of something you sort of, as much as I can agree with that perspective, and I think the book Chain Gang All-Stars, that work also sort of advocating for a more empathetic justice system that both respects the humanity of incarcerated populations and considers how to give them pathways to a better life. I thought Correction actually sort of struggled to consider the other side of that story. Whereas at least in Chain Gang All-Stars, I flagged a section because I thought it was really interesting. It really sort of distills like the sort of like political leaning of the book, but also sort of acknowledges there aren't easy answers to this question here. So this is told from the perspective of one of the protesters against the entertainment, prisoners being turned into entertainment deathmatch people. She goes, I'm an abolitionist, which means I'm interested in investing in communities to address problems rather than carceral answers that don't serve communities at all. Murderers and rapists do great harm, Marie said, but the carceral institutions in this country do little to mitigate that harm. In fact, they do more harm to individuals and communities. The carceral state depends on a dichotomy between innocent and guilty or good and bad, so that they can then define harm on their terms in the name of justice and administer it on a massive scale to support a capitalistic, violent, and inherently inequitable system. And though this is what she said and had said so many times, a part of her even then understood what this reporter was getting at, that there were some people who she did not think should be released, and her father was one of them. I thought that was like radically honest of the author to include in this book, because it's something I've personally known a lot of people who have dedicated their lives to prison abolitionism as a cause. And I don't think I've ever heard a very satisfactory answer I think what you hear from people is that there is so much over incarceration of marginalized or otherwise disadvantaged populations, that focusing on the small population of people who are truly like irredeemable or just need to be warehoused to protect a broader society is almost like a distraction or a conversation they don't want to engage in. But if anyone here is actually interested in prison abolition or abolitionism generally as a goal, I just think it is so necessary for you to consider that if you're talking to people who exist outside of academic institutions, you have to be able to answer for what you do with people who I think there has to be a point at which incapacitation has to take precedent over redemption or rehabilitation, even if that is a very small slice of the pie. And I just think you have to be realistic about that, even if you want to imagine a society way less reliant on incarceration, broadly speaking. It honestly made me so sad that the one family in corrections made it their whole identity to attend parole hearings. Yeah, that's certainly, I think sad is the right word there, right? But I guess there isn't a right answer to this question in terms of, how would you want people to move on from, like we in both these books, there's this sort of idea, especially in correction, this idea that these people are not the worst thing they've ever done. The crime they very likely committed between the ages of 18 and 26, which is when most young men are, with their not fully developed brains, are in a position or in the circumstances under which they will commit some of these acts, should their entire life be defined by a terrible thing they did when they're 18 years old? I think a lot of us want to have an empathetic reaction to that, right? But at the same time, if your child or, if someone you loved more than anything was taken away from you under those circumstances, I don't know how satisfying it is to hear that, that person isn't the worst thing they've ever done. Because what you lost, the person you lost, they don't have the luxury of ever having that future that isn't defined by that worst moment. And you'll hear this from victims of crime, if we're just being very honest about this, right? That they have a life before and after they experience that victimization. And there's no going back from that. There's healing that can happen from that. But I do believe you can take something from people that you can't undo. In Norway, we don't have life sentences, but we have one man that will not be let out. He gets new hearings every 21 years, so technically he could get out. Yeah, my understanding is that in Norway, I think 20-year sentences are sort of by default the max as life sentences. And beyond that, someone would have to be labeled as a dangerous offender to continue to be incarcerated. Which to me actually is a system that makes a lot of sense and is not too unlike the Canadian system. Those men literally grew up in prison. I'm 30 and I'm not the same person I was at 17 or 19, just like they aren't. Yeah, absolutely. But I heard this is maybe I remember I was reading some reporting on some young men who committed a sexual crime against a young woman It was like a sports team. There's a huge problem, like the culture of sports and hockey specifically. And you'll hear a lot of, well, you know, these are young men, you know, they made a mistake and we want to give them a second chance. And that sounds like a reasonable thing to say. But when you're saying that, you're basically reducing the victim to being like, you know, that young woman didn't exist for that young man to be a lesson for him to not be a piece of shit. You know what I mean? So I sort of apply that framework to all of this. Anyway, that's just my opinion on it. In terms of expanding parole, I actually think that's a super interesting topic that I don't think we're going to get into a lot in the next 5 minutes, but just that fundamental question of like, is it more fair? Austin, the author of Correction, seems to very much think expanding access to parole would be a good thing. And I think people are surprised that parole isn't something a lot of people have an opportunity even to get. There's lots of states that have no parole at all. But like if you just like take a step back and imagine like a system of justice or a correctional system, would you rather your sentence be sort of determined by a judge at the outset? Or do you want a very sort of fallible human process of someone just sort of deciding when you should or shouldn't be released? I guess they're both fallible or both human processes. I would question the assumption that even a parole hearing, is that a more fair way of deciding someone is ready to be reintegrated into society? It certainly makes sense in the sense that, like, how do you know at sentencing if someone's going to be ready to be released 20 years from now? But the parole system is so flawed as well. There are some crazy judges. There's also, you know, people with their own political persuasions and different ideas and tough on crime. And like it does strike me that the parole process too can be too loose or can swing in either direction in a way that feels not necessarily just. Like there's that famous study that parole boards are way less likely to grant parole if they're approaching a lunch break, because they're getting hungry and they don't want to give serious thought and consideration. They just want to wrap up their hearing. Like that that is not really a system I would want to subject myself to. But I think it's better than the alternative. Or it's better than just indeterminate sentences. Anyway, you want to watch The Shawshank Redemption later? It's occurred to me while reading Correction. Like he explicitly he reads quotes are from The Shawshank Redemption, which at first I thought was a little silly to do in like a serious book. But at the same time, I think it might be fair to say that is there any artifact of pop culture that people are more familiar with about people spending their lives in prison and the possibility of parole and redemption than this movie? I don't think so. Also, Shawshank Redemption famously, I think this is still true, is the highest rated movie ever on IMDb. Like, I don't think I've ever met anyone who didn't like this movie. Maybe it's not like the best movie ever or your favorite critic's favorite movie ever, but it's kind of like maybe one of the most universally loved movies of all time. And I haven't seen it in many years. The documentary 13th on Netflix was also really good. I don't think I did a very good job of getting into sort of the racial component of this conversation at all, and I just don't feel like I'm the most equipped person to do that. So yeah, I haven't seen the 13th. I've heard it's good. Back in grad school, read quite a bit of Louis Lacan, whose theory is basically that the prison industrial complex is in many ways just an extension of Jim Crow policies, or just a way of dealing with this population of racialized people who are not really useful to society from the perspective of an ownership class, let's say. So anyway, yeah, there's a lot to get into there. Louis Wacko? I think it was Louis Wacon. Facon? I think it's a French name. I didn't know there was a novel for Shawshank. I haven't read it. It's Stephen King, right? Isn't Shawshank Redemption Stephen King? It's a novella. Okay. Anyway, 7 p.m. tonight, a little bit of an early showing. I want it to end in time so I can watch some of that violent hockey game. I want to see the end of the Oilers game at least. Have you read Jaws? Very different than the movie. Very on topic. I have not read Jaws, but I have heard it is one of the few obvious examples of a movie being way better than a book. Thank you for the books this month, Ben. Still working on last month's. I sort of gave up on Black Swan halfway through, to be honest. What are next month's books? I think it was Life of Pi and a book about Canadian history that I don't know if we should or shouldn't read. I think the primary book was Life of Pi, I think. And that also has a corresponding book. Am I wrong? Am I right or am I wrong? Where is book list? June, Life of Pi by Jan Martel and A Fair Country by John Ralston Saul. That's actually kind of a controversial book. I'm not going to get into it now. I think there are mixed feelings about the latter book. So yeah, I think Life of Pi for sure. We'll see about the other one. By next month, is it this month? Yes, June books. All right, it's 2:00. Christine's probably streaming now. Menchie Gang? I think there's a way where I can have my stream just go into hers. How do you do that? Customization. Redirect. Allows your viewer add a live stream or premiere for people to watch after yours ends. Search videos from other channels. Simply not logical? That didn't work. I mean, you know where to find Christine, right? Oh, but it's a member stream. That's why I can't find it. All right, you should go watch Christine if you're a member on her channel and hang out. Thank you for showing up. Thank you again to the 5%. All right. Keep on rocking in the free world and doot doodle doot doot.